Pam Bondi didn't hesitate. "You're not nearly as clever as you think you are, Jimmy," she fired off, her voice clear and unshaken. The words hit like a brick, and for the first time in the segment, Jimmy Kimmel blinked, caught off guard. The studio audience, known for their laughter and applause, went silent in a heartbeat. It was a moment nobody expected, and Pam knew it. She had waited, listened, endured every jab and smirk until now. But when Jimmy leaned in with one more smug remark about her political past, that's when she decided no more holding back. What started as another typical segment on Jimmy Kimmel Live had quickly taken a turn. The interview had begun with forced smiles and polite tension, Kimmel tossing in cheeky references to Bondi's time in Florida politics, clearly hoping to provoke her. "So Pam," he'd begun with a grin, "is there an actual playbook you guys pass around for defending the indefensible, or do you just wing it?" The audience laughed, trained by years of punchlines to respond on cue. Pam, unbothered on the surface, smiled coolly and crossed her legs. "You mean like the playbook late-night hosts use to punch down on people they don't understand?" she replied. It was subtle, and the crowd didn't quite catch it at first. But it was a warning shot. She was there on his turf, sure, but she hadn't come to lose. Jimmy grinned, the kind of grin that said he thought he still had control. "I mean, come on," he continued, shifting in his chair. "You went from attorney general to full-time Trump spokesperson. That's like going from law school to selling timeshares in a volcano." Another laugh. The camera panned to the crowd, some smirking, others just waiting for her to fall into the trap. But Pam didn't bite. She let the silence stretch just a little longer than expected before she leaned in slightly and said, "Funny, coming from a guy whose job depends on a monologue written by 3 interns and a YouTube algorithm." Jimmy chuckled, but it wasn't real. It was tight, short. He shifted in his seat again, suddenly aware that she wasn't flinching, wasn't playing along. And in that small shift of posture, she saw the opening. "You sit here," she said slowly, "night after night, making your little jokes about people like me, assuming your audience will always cheer because you've trained them to. You dress it up as comedy, but it's really just another form of bullying, just with better lighting." That's when the laughter stopped entirely. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even angry. But the precision of her words, the way she stared straight through Jimmy without blinking, it cut deeper than any raised voice could. She had cracked his rhythm. Her voice was too calm, too centered, and it disarmed him. Jimmy cleared his throat and tried to change the tone. "Hey, this is just jokes, Pam. We all know you've got thick skin, don't take it too personally." "Oh, I don't," she said with a small smile. "But maybe you should. Because what you call jokes is just disguised cowardice. You don't challenge power, you ridicule anyone who makes you uncomfortable. That's not bravery. That's branding." Someone in the crowd murmured. A producer off camera signaled to wrap the segment soon, but both of them ignored it. Kimmel tried again, but this time his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Okay, now we're getting a little dramatic." "No," Pam said, cutting in. "What's dramatic is pretending you're the voice of the people while mocking half the country for sport. You don't ask questions, you push narratives. And when someone pushes back, you laugh, roll your eyes, and pivot to the next punchline, hoping no one noticed you didn't actually have an answer." It was surgical. She wasn't just defending herself, she was dissecting his entire act, piece by piece. And Kimmel, who usually thrived on throwing others off balance, suddenly looked like a man without his footing. The audience was still, some wide-eyed, others whispering. It wasn't supposed to go this way. She was supposed to get flustered, deflect, maybe even stumble over a soundbite. Instead, she was delivering a critique so pointed, so undeniable, that even the people in the control room weren't sure whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling. Pam Bondi leaned back, hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair, looking entirely at ease. But her message had landed like thunder. Jimmy forced another smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, and the interview wasn't even halfway over. Pam didn't even flinch. The smile remained on her face, but behind it was a woman who had just been underestimated again. She leaned forward, locking eyes with Jimmy in a way that suddenly drained the humor from the room. The audience, which had chuckled seconds ago, now sensed a shift. Pam's southern charm melted into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. "You know, Jimmy," she said, voice still velvet but laced with steel, "it's funny how comedians think they're untouchable just because they hide behind a punchline. But when your jokes stop being clever and start sounding like the talking points of a DC echo chamber, you're not being funny anymore. You're just another mouthpiece in a cheap suit." Jimmy blinked. The studio, always electric with energy, now felt trapped in a long inhale that wouldn't release. He opened his mouth to fire back, another witty jab locked and loaded. But Pam wasn't finished. She stood up. Not in anger, not in grandstanding, but with the grace of someone stepping up to deliver a final blow they'd practiced 1,000 times. "You brought me here to mock me," she continued. "That's the trick. You think if you laugh first, it means you've already won. But you don't get to twist facts and frame truth as lunacy just because your audience claps on cue. You don't win just because you say it with a smile. That's not clever. That's cowardice." The words landed like bricks. Not loud, not shouted, but chosen with surgical precision. Jimmy shifted in his chair. He tried to grin again, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. The studio lights still burned above. The camera still rolled, but for a moment, the entire room had forgotten they were part of a show. They were witnessing something else now, a reckoning, live and unfiltered. Pam stepped closer to her chair but didn't sit. "You called me dangerous," she said, her voice calm now, even gentler. "You said people like me are what's wrong with America. But let me tell you what's really dangerous. Pretending you're enlightened while laughing at real people's struggles. You make fun of rural America. You mock faith, values, anything that doesn't come out of a Hollywood writer's room. And you think it makes you brave? Jimmy, it makes you boring." No one dared move. The audience, who had come to watch a celebrity talk show, now sat silent, as if they'd been pulled into a different dimension. One where laughter was no longer a shield, and applause no longer a cue. Pam Bondi wasn't a politician anymore. In that moment, she was something else, something harder to dismiss. And Jimmy Kimmel, once the master of controlled chaos, sat in his chair, unsure whether to laugh, respond, or simply survive the next few minutes. Pam stood there, poised, waiting for the response that would inevitably come. Jimmy's usual swagger, the confidence that had once made him a late-night legend, had evaporated. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at his notes and then at the audience, as if searching for a lifeline. But there was no easy out. The tables had turned. The comedic game he prided himself on was no longer a match for the serious, no-nonsense truth Pam was laying down. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jimmy let out a nervous chuckle. "Well, I didn't expect that," he said, trying to recover his composure. But his voice cracked just slightly, betraying the uncertainty he was desperately trying to mask. Pam's eyes remained fixed on him. She wasn't done. In fact, she was just getting started. "I know you didn't expect it, Jimmy," she replied with a slight tilt of her head, her voice smooth and almost soothing, but carrying a weight that resonated in every corner of the studio. "And that's exactly the problem. You thought you could come at me with your snarky comedian routine, and that would be enough. That people like you could hold power over the narrative just because you're good at making people laugh." Jimmy's grin faltered again. The crowd, initially caught up in his side of the banter, was now hanging on every word Pam spoke. The applause they had showered on him before seemed like a distant memory. The balance of the show had shifted, and the scales were tipping far more in Pam's favor. "Let me tell you something, Jimmy," she continued, her tone hardening but never raising in volume. "Being funny doesn't make you right, and sometimes it doesn't make you brave either. You know what's brave? Saying things that aren't popular. Standing up for what's right, not what's convenient. That's the real courage. That's what's been missing from this conversation the whole time. For a moment, Jimmy seemed at a loss. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but nothing came out. The audience, who had been primed to cheer on the next punchline, now looked at him for the comeback that never came. They were watching a slow realization dawn in real time. Pam wasn't just firing back with a comeback. She was dismantling his entire approach. She took a slow step forward, never breaking eye contact, the weight of her words settling between them like a deep breath before the storm. You made it your job to make a mockery of me, of my beliefs, my party, my values. But what do you really stand for, Jimmy? What's your mission? To make people laugh at others' pain? To ridicule them for what they believe? To drive wedges between us all and pretend it's all just a joke? Her voice softened briefly, but the sting of each sentence lingered. That's not funny. That's cowardice, plain and simple. You think the real issues in this country are fodder for jokes, but guess what? The rest of us are tired of being the punchline. We're tired of watching politicians and people like you get away with making fun of what we hold dear. Jimmy, visibly uncomfortable now, tried to steer the conversation back to something lighthearted. Well, Pam, I just think you might be overreacting a little bit. No, I'm not overreacting. Pam cut him off, her voice now fully firm, no trace of hesitation left. What I'm doing is exactly what needs to be done. I'm giving a voice to the people who have been silenced, dismissed as small town or backward, just because they don't fit the mold of your Hollywood bubble. A tense silence fell over the set. Jimmy, once the one in control, now looked like a man backed into a corner, out of quips and out of time. His audience, the very ones who usually cheered him on with every sarcastic remark, now found themselves unsure of what to do. The laughter had died, replaced with an almost stunned silence. The palpable tension in the air was not one of mere discomfort, but a reflection of the deeper conversation taking place between Pam and Jimmy, a conversation they hadn't expected to have in this forum. Pam stood there, unwavering, watching as Jimmy tried to regain his footing, but there was no more humor left to be salvaged. The thin veneer of comedy had been stripped away, leaving nothing but truth, raw and unfiltered. Do you understand, Jimmy? Pam asked, her voice steady, though the weight of her words hung heavy. You can keep making jokes. You can keep laughing. But at the end of the day, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to fix the things that are broken in this country. And it's definitely not going to fix the trust people have lost in public figures like you, who get on television and pretend like nothing matters but your next punchline. Pam didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she let the silence stretch. It was an uncomfortable quiet, but it was also a necessary one. She was not done making her point. Not yet. I don't need your approval, Jimmy, and frankly, I don't need anyone else's either. What I need is for the truth to be heard. For people to understand that what we're facing is bigger than any joke. Bigger than any late-night monologue. She paused for a beat, locking eyes with him again. You've got your platform, but I've got mine. And when it comes down to it, I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to make a difference. Jimmy was silent, his eyes no longer looking at her with a playful edge but with something else. A mixture of respect, maybe even regret. The air in the studio was thick now, heavy with the realization that this wasn't just a political debate or a scripted moment for the late-night show. This was something deeper, something real. The audience, too, felt it. The tension between the two had shifted from playful banter to something much more profound. Pam's words had struck a chord, not just with Jimmy, but with everyone in that room. The atmosphere in the studio was no longer a typical late-night environment. What had started as a simple back-and-forth banter had escalated into something much bigger, a collision of ideals. A stark contrast between the trivial world of late-night comedy and the hard-hitting truths. Pam was now laying bare for the world to see. It wasn't just a talk show anymore. It was a confrontation. Pam stood there, unshaken, as Jimmy, still struggling to regain his usual composure, searched for a way out of the verbal crossfire. He knew it was over. He had already lost the upper hand, and no snarky remark or clever retort would get him back into the game. Pam wasn't just a guest on his show. She had become the driving force of the conversation, and the audience could feel it. They weren't waiting for the next punchline. They weren't even sure if there would be one. Instead, they were riveted by the sincerity in Pam's voice, the conviction with which she spoke. Each word she uttered carried weight, and the momentary amusement they had found in Jimmy's comedic routine now felt hollow in comparison. "You know, Jimmy," Pam continued, her voice steady and unwavering, "I've been in politics long enough to know how easy it is to be swept away in the noise. To hide behind a joke, a laugh, and pretend that the things that matter don't require real action. You've built an empire on making light of serious issues. And for a long time, people have been okay with it. Because it's comfortable. Because it's easy." There was no mocking in her tone, no condemnation, just raw honesty, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. She wasn't accusing Jimmy of being a bad person. She was holding up a mirror to him, forcing him to look at the impact his words and actions had over the years. And in that reflection, there was a truth that could no longer be ignored. "For years," Pam went on, "people have laughed at politicians like me, have laughed at the issues I fight for, the communities I serve, the values I hold. They've made jokes at our expense, at the expense of real people, real struggles. But do you know what I realized, Jimmy? The more they laughed, the more they ignored the real problems. The more they trivialized the pain and the hardships that we face every single day." Jimmy shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable now, no longer able to charm his way out of the situation. He cleared his throat and tried to speak, but Pam wasn't finished. She knew that if she let him interrupt her now, the moment would be lost. So she pressed on, each word more powerful than the last. "You've been part of the problem, Jimmy. Not because you don't mean well, hell. Maybe you do. But because you've chosen to hide behind humor when what's needed is action. What's needed is real conversation. And it's time for the joke to end." There was no laughter in the audience now. No chuckles, no applause. The crowd was silent, each person hanging on to every syllable, their attention fully captivated by Pam's unwavering resolve. This wasn't just a political statement. This was a moment of reckoning. She wasn't asking for approval. She was demanding respect. For a split second, Jimmy looked almost lost. His famous late-night smirk, the one that had earned him a reputation as the king of comedy, faltered. It was as though he had forgotten where he was for a moment, lost in the weight of Pam's words. His eyes flickered to the audience, but they weren't the usual sea of familiar faces who fed off his every jest. These were people who had, at least for tonight, shifted their allegiance. They weren't here for jokes anymore. They were here for something real. Pam took a slow step forward, her voice lowering in intensity, but still commanding. "And you know what, Jimmy? That's okay. It's okay to realize that it's time to step up. It's okay to admit that the things we joke about can have real consequences. But the real question is, are you willing to change? Are you willing to use your platform for something that matters?" The room felt even quieter. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one seemingly longer than the last. Jimmy knew the answer, and he knew it wasn't something he could just brush off. The facade was gone. The punchlines, the snark, it was all stripped away, leaving only the reality of the situation. He finally opened his mouth, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. I don't know if I'm the person to make that change, Pam. I don't." "Then who is?" Pam interrupted, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity of someone who had spent years fighting for the very causes Jimmy had poked fun at. "If not you, then who? You have the power to do something with your voice, with your platform. And you've spent all these years making people laugh. But sometimes, Jimmy, you need to ask yourself, What's so funny about ignoring the truth? The tension in the room reached its peak, and for the first time since the show had started, it felt like Jimmy didn't have the answers. He had no clever comeback, no sharp retort. The audience, once his loyal following, was now waiting for him to respond, and the pressure was palpable. It was as if they, too, had shifted their focus, now realizing that there was more at stake in this conversation than a late-night joke. Pam stood there, resolute, with the quiet power of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they stood for. "I'm not here to fight with you, Jimmy. I'm here to challenge you. To challenge everyone who's ever thought that they could just make jokes about the things that matter. It's time for something different. It's time for real change." Jimmy stared at her for a moment, and then slowly he nodded. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It wasn't a grand gesture of apology, but it was enough. The audience, who had been sitting on the edge of their seats, now let out a collective breath. They could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the moment when everything had changed. Pam hadn't just stunned Jimmy. She had stunned everyone in that room. And for once, Jimmy Kimmel wasn't the one holding all the cards. The power had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, the late-night host was the one left speechless, unsure of how to proceed. The silence that filled the studio was thick with anticipation. The weight of Pam's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Jimmy sat there, frozen, his usual banter nowhere to be found. For once, the spotlight wasn't on him. It was squarely on Pam Bondi, and she wasn't backing down. The audience waited. Some were still processing what had just unfolded. Others, particularly those who had been following the political undercurrents of the debate, felt as though they had just witnessed a seismic shift in the dynamic. But one thing was clear. Pam had made her point. She had stood her ground, unapologetically, and forced everyone, including Jimmy, to confront the uncomfortable truth. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jimmy took a deep breath and spoke, his voice more subdued than ever before. "Well, I guess there's no going around it. You've got a point, Pam. I don't think I've really thought about it like that." The audience, stunned into silence moments earlier, now began to stir. There was a ripple of acknowledgement, of something akin to respect for the candor that had been displayed in the last few minutes. Jimmy's admission wasn't the easy laugh or the typical "I'm just kidding" moment he was used to delivering. This time he had been called out, and he knew it. But instead of deflecting with humor, he took responsibility, if only for a brief moment. Pam didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had said what she came to say, and there was no joy in seeing her opponent falter. There was only the satisfaction of knowing that the conversation had finally shifted. The game wasn't over, but the rules had changed. "Sometimes, Jimmy," she replied, her voice calm but firm, "we all need to pause and reflect. You don't have to change overnight, but the fact that you're even willing to consider the impact of your words, that's progress. And that's something." The tension that had weighed so heavily on the studio began to lift. The audience, slowly but surely, started to applaud. It wasn't the kind of applause reserved for a punchline or a funny skit. This was different. This was a moment of recognition. The crowd knew that they had just witnessed something rare, a moment of real substance in a late-night talk show. Jimmy nodded, acknowledging the applause, but he didn't try to take credit. The crowd wasn't there for him. They were there for the realness Pam had brought into the conversation. And in that moment, Jimmy Kimmel became a witness rather than the star of the show. Pam's eyes scanned the room, her gaze calm, not looking for praise but simply seeking the quiet validation that came with standing up for what was right. It's easy to make jokes about the world. It's harder to face the reality of it. But if we're all going to change, it starts with a willingness to hear each other, to understand each other. The applause grew louder. There was a warmth to the claps now, an understanding that they had seen something more than just a celebrity encounter. They had seen a rare moment of growth, of transformation. Pam wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for anyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or marginalized. And Jimmy, in his own way, had listened. Jimmy took a step back, his usual sharp wit now tempered with humility. "You're right, Pam. I'm going to think about this. Maybe I'll take some time off, do a little more listening. Maybe it's time for me to really look at the bigger picture." Pam gave him a nod, not out of sympathy, but recognition. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about fostering real change, one conversation at a time. She didn't need to fight anymore. The fight had already been won, not with sharp words or a heated argument, but with the quiet power of truth. As the segment wrapped up, the audience continued to applaud, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Respect for Pam's courage to speak up. Respect for Jimmy's humility in admitting his shortcomings. And respect for the truth that had just come to light, truths that no one could ignore anymore. Jimmy Kimmel, the king of late-night television, had just been bested. But it wasn't a defeat in the traditional sense. It was a victory for authenticity. A victory for the idea that sometimes, in order to move forward, we all need to pause and reflect, not just on our actions, but on the words we choose and the ways we choose to use our platforms. And as the credits rolled, with Pam Bondi standing tall and unwavering, she knew this moment would be remembered. It wasn't just about the show, the confrontation, or the temporary shift in dynamics. It was about something bigger, a reminder that even in the world of late-night comedy, real change can begin with one powerful voice speaking out. The audience left the studio that night, still buzzing with the energy of what had just happened. Jimmy Kimmel's usual charisma had taken a backseat to something more profound, and Pam Bondi had just delivered the kind of savage comeback that no one would forget anytime soon. As the lights dimmed and the studio doors closed, there was a feeling in the air, a sense of the world having shifted ever so slightly, as if the stage had been set for something new. And in that moment, it was clear. Pam Bondi had not just stunned Jimmy Kimmel, she had stunned the world.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.